Hello, everybody. Welcome in. We are so excited to be here with you today. Thanks for spending your time with us. I am going to ask Stephanie a super deep, amazing question. Stephanie, I am curious. Was there ever a time that you thought you would quit playing the piano, and why did you persevere?
Yeah, that's great. So let's see here. Is there ever a time? Well, I'm trying to decide like which time. um, yeah, I guess I'll just like scale back. I started learning piano when I was very young, and was very consistent up into a certain point, like around like 10 or 11. My parents got divorced, and there wasn't a lot of consistency in my household, and so I was really grateful for those first 5 years of playing. But really, in my teenage years, I kind of sort of like I dabbled with piano. I played sometimes, but I didn't really. It just was sort of one of those things where I just wasn't really sure how it was going to lead me or where it was going to lead me at all at that time. Obviously, you don't know anything when you're a teenager, but I feel like some kids and some teens seem to have a really clear vision, and I don't think that I ever would have guessed that music would be what I ended up doing professionally. Um, so I I think I've shared my story in another podcast, so I don't. But I decided to go to college for piano because I was accompanying for a church at the time, and they needed an accompanist, and I had this issue where I would like continue to I had to drop out because I would get lost in the music, and it was just this sort of humiliating experience for a 17-year-old, 16-year-old, where it's like you forget where you are and you stop playing while this whole church congregation is singing, and it's just like that continued to happen. So I decided I wanted to go to college to be good at accompanying this church. And that was basically like, I'm like, well, I'm not going to be good enough to be a pianist, so I'm going to have to probably be like a choir director or a band director. But I'm like, I don't really play a band instrument, and I don't want to teach people how to sing in choir. I have minimal experience with that, especially at that time. So it's like, I think just like I'm going to just go for it and see. So I practiced a bunch in my undergraduate degree, to the point where I was able to get my performance degree and then moved to Portland State. And it's sort of like, I don't know about you actually, but I think that like I've had this weird sort of imposter syndrome thing where it's like I was able to catch up. And I think it's attributed to the fact that I played for like years really consistently as a very young child. And then I really pushed into hyperdrive when I like hit college. But I always had like this sort of like imposter syndrome thing that really kicked in strongly once I started getting my master's degree. So I had strongly considered fully quitting music, when I had done a performance that was in preparation for my graduate recital. And I'd had a series of other experiences before where I was like, why are you doing this? But it wasn't like full on. I think it's just sort of like the imposter syndrome thing. It just kept coming up where it was just like, are you really good enough to be doing this? Like, if anybody knew that you didn't really practice when you were a teenager, if anybody really knew that like you didn't get any music scholarships in college and you did this or whatever, like if people knew, like then they'd be like, oh, like yeah, it's funny how you tell yourself these weird kind of stories, and whether they're true or not, they're seriously unhelpful. But I was at my graduate recital preparation performance, and it was one of those things where it's just like I was really busy, yada yada. Long story short, I had a tough performance. It basically took a giant shit all over the piano, excuse my French, and I couldn't remember how to play notes very well at all. Things, it was a very intimate performance. It had been promoted, so there was like there was probably like 30 people, but I didn't really know any of them. They were all like classical music, lovers, and knew all the pieces I was performing, and I just didn't do well. And I remember it was like one of those things where I was done, and I left and I went into the back room, and I remembered my professor. She was like, you just need to go back out there and acknowledge everybody and shake their hand and say thank you for coming. And I was like, I cannot do that. I'm sorry, that's just not something that I can do. This is way too much for me. I'm quitting. This is enough. She's like, these people showed up to hear you. You need to go out there and thank every single person for coming. And it was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, honestly, because when you have some of those shameful experiences, all you do is run the other direction and never see anybody that you had the experience like in front of ever again. But it's one of the greatest lessons I ever learned. And one of the people that I talked to, I played this Chopin Polonaise, and it was really literally it was maybe got like 20% of the notes. But this lady told me, she's like, oh, that Chopin Polonaise made me cry. It was so emotional. And I'm like, I don't know if you were feeling my emotion from, I'm sure you got some emotion, but I don't know if it's what Chopin intended. But anyway, it was just after that, I remember I was on the swing set with one of my best friends who was also preparing for a recital. And I was just like, I don't think I can ever do this again. And it was just kind of that face down moment where you're just like, you just feel humiliated and you feel like all this work has been for naught. And it's just the culmination of all the garbage. But then I just remember, like, after a while, I was like, this is just road, like this is just gonna be how it's gonna be sometimes, and it ultimately, no one else gets to determine the trajectory of my life except for me. And I think what really made me decide to, like, why would I continue if that's what's gonna happen? Why? Because sometimes that just happens in life, no matter what it is. It could be a relationship, it could be a goal, be really literally anything. Like, you're gonna have some seriously face down hard, like, knock me up moments of just like, this feels like complete and utter, crap. And I think that what helped me to remember was, like, I had to go out and thank people for coming. So there was so much gratitude that, like, I kind of was forced to feel that now in, like, retrospect, I'm like, oh, I really feel so much gratitude that I had to do that and that those people came. And also just like, yeah, I I think that we need those moments, like, where we don't do well. And it's like, so many people quit because they had a bad experience where they had a meltdown on stage. I've had several of those too. I didn't tell you those stories, but those have happened to me too. Like, I have so many students and just other fellow musicians who quit because they have that one moment where they're like, I have to quit. I cannot ever feel like this again. But then you realize that, like, that's just taking a risk in life. Like, life is full of risks. And if you don't go all in, you're never going to know what's going to happen. And those risks will always teach you something profound. And I don't know exactly sometimes why I continue, because it is painful at times. But the thing is like, you could argue that for life, right? I mean, sometimes life is really hard and sometimes life is really painful, and it's worth it to persevere, because those challenging moments, they reel you into a deeper and equally more enlightened human being, I would argue. And so I guess it's like, why do I persevere? Why do I persevere? Like, because there's only one direction. You either move forward or you don't, and I think that every time I, like, question quitting, I'm like, if I quit, I'm only letting me down, and if it's not this, I'm going to take a risk with something else, and then I'm going to have a big failure with that, and welcome to the frickin' world, So I think it's just like, it's just a reminder that, like, failure does not equal, like, termination. Failure can be beautiful. In fact, it always is, especially in retrospect. And I think that if we can just remember that, like, if we are brave enough to take a risk, and if we have courage to put ourselves out there in front of other people, the result doesn't really even matter, because that courage that you had to pull upon to do something that was scary is so character developing and just really beautiful and all that. So I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent, but I just think, like, for all of you listeners out there who have quit or who are considering it or whatever, have had a face down moment, I just want to remind you that we all have had those, and it's worth it to keep going if you want to, because there's so much richness on the other side of the challenge. So yeah, and I'm so curious, Ashley, to hear what you have to say. Is there ever a time that you thought you would quit music or piano? And yeah, why did you choose to persevere?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for your share. I loved everything that you said, and I fully agree. And it's funny because as you were kind of wrapping up, I was thinking, this is really just good advice for life in general. And then that's exactly where you went. And I fully agree. I think that, yeah. So for me, I also started super young. There were definitely times along my journey where I wanted to quit, and my mom encouraged me to continue on, and I'm so glad that she did. because obviously I wouldn't be where I am now or doing what I'm doing now if she didn't. But in a more extreme way, I did quit for about, I guess technically for a year. So in 2015, I left the United States and went and taught English in Korea for a year. And a large catalyst of doing that for me was that I was not happy doing what I was doing. I had graduated from grad school in Los Angeles, and I was teaching a private studio, but I was driving around to people's houses, and I was so burnt out and so exhausted. And what I was doing and how I was spending my time with music did not look at all how I intended it, and didn't look, I wasn't doing the things that I went to school for. I wasn't happy doing what I was doing. Not because, I mean, I've always loved teaching, but the way in which I was doing it and the way I was running my business and the way that I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing was really, really, really hard for me. So much so that I was like, wow, okay, well, you know, I feel like I had this experience in school where I practiced 4 to 8 hours a day, and I went to school and I learned about music and I loved all of that. And how do I actually now like make money and make this sustainable and make this a career and do this day in and day out for the rest of my life? And it felt so overwhelming, and I didn't like how it was happening. And so I decided to go to English and teach Korea for a year. And going into that, I knew that I was quitting for an amount of time. So I put a time on it. I said, I'm not going to do anything related to music for this year. And I'm going to have this completely different experience, which I always wanted to have. I always thought that like studying abroad would be amazing, but I didn't ever do that in college or grad school. And my test to myself, which is really funny, but my test to myself was like, I'm going to see if I miss music. I'd never stopped since I was 4 when I started. I'd never taken any length of time off other than maybe like a couple months in the summer, but most of my teachers growing up like taught through the summer. So I had really never had any time off. And so my test was, if I go to Korea and teach English for a year, will I miss music? And if so, that will inform me on what my choices will be when I get back. So I went, and for about, I want to say like 5 or 6 months, I did not miss music. I was having a great time doing other things. I was able to like get rid of my guilt about not practicing. I just like enjoyed the experience. And then I started to feel like something was missing. And I really felt like a deep way of expression was missing, and like I did have things inside that I didn't know how to express, and that I didn't have an outlet for. And so I ended up, after 6 months, finding a piano school where I could go, and they were so kind, the people that own this piano school. I offered to like pay them a monthly fee to come use a practice room, and they just let me do it. They were like, here's a key, you can come anytime after we close, like just come in and practice. And so, I mean, I wasn't like practicing intensely, but I did go, you know, maybe like once or twice a week and just play for my own enjoyment, and I allowed that to be what it was. And so then during that 6 months where I was kind of playing the piano and having this different experience, I realized that I didn't want to quit music and I didn't want to give up on everything that I had done. But when I came back to the States, if I was going to continue on doing music, it had to be totally different than how I was doing it before. And so I was thinking about like, why do I play music? And I think for me, that is really what helped me persevere, is I had to get down to the why, and I had to get more in alignment with like not doing it the way that didn't work, but coming up with like what was missing, what was it about music that I did miss, and how do I make sure that coming back to music, I keep that goal in the forefront of my eyes always in any choice that I make regarding music. And so, I mean, I won't continue on with the story because that's not part of the question, but like basically I came back and met you, Stephanie. I did figure out that the reason that I do music is because of connection. Like, I love connecting with music and with that part of myself. I love connecting with my students, with other musicians, with audience members when I'm performing. And so Stephanie had a similar take, and we founded Connection Experiment, and started a concert series is how it started, really to highlight that connection through performance. And then that evolved to teaching classes together and having a membership, and now here we are doing this podcast. So it was hard. And I think getting in touch with the why is a really important thing always. And sometimes we won't have the answer, and sometimes maybe we're not ready to see the answer, but I try to use that now, whenever my life is out of alignment or I'm feeling a lot of resentment and like not enjoying what I'm doing. Why am I doing it? And it's such an important question, and one that I think, especially at least in the United States, like we forget to ask because it's so easy to just get wrapped up in the hustle or wrapped up in the things we think we're supposed to be doing. But I think that it's so important to ask why always. Why are we doing it? Why is someone asking us to do it? Does it make sense for us to do it? And when we start to ask why, then we get to some of those other really important questions about, are these things that we really want? Is this on my priority list? Is there a way that I could do it differently? Is there a way that I could spend my time that would change this? All of those other questions that are super important that, not only impact music, but our entire lives. So that's my answer.
So true. Yeah, everything you said really resonates, and I think that if we can just remember our why and why am I doing this, and like realizing that you really miss those qualities that music brings, that you can express yourself through music in ways that you can't with words, and yeah, there's so much beauty and connection that can be made through music. So we hope that you've enjoyed this podcast. We hope that you feel a little bit more connected to your why. And we'd love to hear from you too. If you have a story that you would be willing to share, we would love to hear from you. We like to feature listeners and students all the time on our podcast, so definitely get in touch with us if this resonated in any way with you. We're really loving this podcast, but it is kind of like West out here. We're just putting our stories out there, hoping that you'll do the same. So check out our membership too, because it is super cool and it's all about this kind of stuff. So we hope that you'll connect with us, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Yep. Thanks for spending your time with us. Bye. We are so grateful for you. Thank you for spending your time with us today.
Our podcast is inspired by people like you.
If you're looking to dig deep and discover your authentic artist, then join us today by visiting our website, connectionexperiment.com.